Welcome to a deck tech of Time Vault Academy. I'm going to be talking about the history of the deck as I've played it, some of the philosophies that guide the deck construction, talking about some of the principles and play patterns of the deck and my success with it. I'm going to be walking through some of the different renditions, the tournament decks that I took to a championship at the House of Cards Fall Classic, as well as second at the Cosmic Games event, talking about the current list, some of the matchups and mulligan decisions that go into playing the list, and some of the things that I'm looking at testing in the future, and some of the ideas that I'm going to be moving forward and trying. To kick us off, I want to talk about how this deck sort of came to be, this version of it, and the way that I played it. At the point in time, 3-ish months ago, I was playing Thoracle, 4-color pile, as a list that I took from one of the Yellow Jacket tournaments. And I wanted to layer in the Paradox Academy style game plan. I really like playing with artifacts. I like playing with Clarion Academy. And so I brewed up this deck called Thoracle Academy. And this is not a good deck. I didn't play it in paper, but it was sort of the initial conception of the idea of layering a somewhat controlling game plan, counter spells, miscalculation, remand, reprieve, as reprieve's not in this list, but layering it alongside the sort of fundamental A plus B strengths available to Thassa's Oracle. So you play this sort of generally controlling game plan, followed up with the ability to pivot to an A plus B combo at the point in time that you need to. Thoracle sort of empirically doesn't layer with an artifact strategy. And so very quickly I realized that if I wanted to play an A plus B alongside an artifact game plan, it was not going to be best done with Thoracle. So this deck pretty quickly was retired. You know, the Eladamri's Call to find Thoracle doesn't help find the One Ring. And the idea being that if I'm going to layer these two ideas, I should be layering them with Time Vault. This spawned the championship deck that I took to the House of Cards Fall Classic. This is sort of this is my first tournament that I had taken Time Vault to. I had been really impressed with the deck in testing, and I was really excited to see how I was able to perform in a tournament, and I won, which was really cool. It's fun to see that your proof of concept was able to be executed on and taken to the high level. In the semifinals, in the quarterfinals, semifinals, and finals, I didn't drop a game. I went 6-0 through the top 8, which was sort of further affirmation that I was onto something, that I had come up with a plan that was pretty strong and pretty hard to beat. The initial sort of strategy is that I wanted a deck that had a good matchup into Jeskai. Jeskai is a deck that I respect a very large amount. It is very, very strong. It has a lot of options. It is tough to beat, and I wanted a deck that sort of played well into Jeskai in the hopes that if I could beat Jeskai, I could beat anything. I played against 2 Jeskai matchups in the quarterfinals and in the finals. I think all the maybe finals was blue-red tempo. But the idea sort of remained that I wanted a deck that was not going to fold to counter magic in the way that Paradox Academy did. And I wanted a deck that had both mid-range and combo game plans sort of as a fundamental baseline for the deck. The first philosophical choice that I made was I wanted to include black for hand attack. I think hand attack is sort of there's 2 real strengths of it. First is that many decks in this format, especially ones that are more all-in on combo, have a very tough time beating hand attack. A surgical removal of a particular piece of game plan it can be pretty backbreaking. The ability to have an academy in my deck and the ability to play a mind twist and balance as sort of broad-reaching hand disruption and hand hate also is a boon. I wanted to be able to get information as well. That's the other sort of core component of hand attack. When you are playing a deck that has a primary control game plan, knowledge is king. What to interact with is the most powerful piece of information you can have. So a turn 1 hand attack spell is really valuable at putting and applying pressure on more combo-oriented decks, knowing what the clock is going to look like against aggro decks, and it can be pretty disruptive, especially on the play, to yank a Moxen or a Lotus or a Tutor out of the core game plan of the deck. So hand attack was crux as an initial deck building philosophy. The second one is what I call a tempo counterspell suite. you'll notice cards like Remand and Reprieve are sort of fundamental staples of this list. And as I move forward through the list, you'll see that they don't go anywhere. A large reason for that is that this deck, as a control deck, wants to buy time. The mid-range game plan that we have is slower than most aggro game plans. And so the ability to stall or even just buy a turn or two is pretty relevant when we want to be able to make our land drops. And of course, buying time with an Urza Saga on the battlefield is pretty powerful. It's pretty relevant, both in the ability to make the constructs, which represents a core fundamental part of the the artifact game plan that we have, as this is one of our most powerful mid-range pieces. And then, of course, the final chapter of Urza Saga finds one half of the A+B combo in Time Vault and one of the keys. So buying time and having counterspells that you're willing to just sort of dump on turn 2 and turn 3 pretty aggressively can be very powerful. Counterspells also play generally well into Jeskai. It's a deck that plays counter magic, tries to play a more permission-based game plan, and so having the ability to force through 2-drops on turn 3 or 4 with a 2-mana counterspell backup led to me playing almost every 2-mana counterspell that I could. So, of course, Counterspell, Lose Focus, Mana Leak, Miscalc, Muddle, Remand, Reprieve, even a Lone Mental Misstep for some of those early ones. And you'll notice as the deck evolves on over time that I lean even further into this game plan, and my interaction suite gets more broad and more flexible as I identify ways to continue to play this sort of early interactive game plan, followed up by a pretty strong mid-range that tends to be pretty backbreaking into a deck like Jeskai. One of the other philosophies that guided this deck was high card quality. One of the flaws of decks, especially Paradox-style decks, is you end up with a bunch of these bad cards. Talismans are not inherently good cards. They are, mana ramp on turn 2 and 3, but they don't really advance your game plan outside of the synergy that they have, which is why the layered component of the game plan is so important. Your talismans are not good by themselves. But Talismans plus, Tolarian Academy is quite good. It makes your Tolarian Academy an Ancient Tomb or an Ancient Tomb plus. And so it gives you access to a lot of mana. Well, having payoffs for a lot of mana is good, but it also requires you to play cards that are not particularly castable early on in the game. Cards like Kappa Cannoneer, even things like War of Invention, which require you to expend a lot of mana to get value out of, Mind Twists, things like that. These artifacts are really sort of necessary for these cards to be usable. And in the same breath, we want to be careful not to overload on bad cards. So you'll notice that there are, a relatively finely tuned suite of some of the higher power cards. We have a Ponder, we have a Preordained, we have a Git Probe, we have a Brainstorm. That's it for cantrips. We play the 4 best ones. We're not interested in the rest. For hand attack, it's the same thing. Thoughtseize, Duress, Inquisition, Mind Twist. Balance, kind of, and that's primarily it. We play a pretty lean tutor suite. There's no Fabricate in this list. I think the worst tutor is either the Reshape or the Search for Glory at 3 and or 4 mana respectively. But most of the rest of the suite is pretty compact. Wargate X equals 0 is a very common thing to do. Sylvan Scrying is the worst land tutor maybe Search for Glory, but Sylvan Scrying is probably the worst dedicated land tutor that we play. We're not on some of the more Paradox Academy style cards, which again was one of the decks that I played a lot leading up to playing Time Vault. One of the ideas that I wanted to leverage here is having a mid-range game plan that was able to pay off all these artifacts. So cards like Karn, Sign of Urza, Saheeli, Urza itself, of course the aforementioned Urza Saga, which is sort of a core fundamental part of this deck, are ways to pay off this mid-range artifact game plan, Retrofitter Foundry with Tolarian Academy or Urza. These are ways that artifacts pay off into a mid-range game plan that can be a threat unto itself while you're building up the resources and the materials and the tools in order to be able to execute on a combo game plan. Something like Baleful Strix is a good example of a card that is performing 2 or 3 different functions. It's an excellent card against aggro. It provides a solid blocker in the face of Murktides. It also cantrips, which is nice. It's good to be able to deploy things that replace your hand. And it's an artifact. The fact that it's an artifact is extremely relevant in a deck that's trying to play artifact payoffs. One of the principles that I used as a guiding idea or philosophy for this deck that came from Academy is that or from Paradox Academy, is that you want to have multiple mana early on in the game. Cards like Chrome Mox, Mox Diamond, Mox Opal, having access to 2 mana on turn 1 allows you to deploy talismans. Even cards like Ancient Tomb here, like you can play, Bayou into Crop Rotation, into Ancient Tomb, into Talisman, into Thoughtseize, for example. And that sets you up to have 3 or 4 or 5 mana on turn 2, 3, 4, which allows you to deploy some of these more costly threats way ahead of curve. It's very hard to beat an Urza that came down on turn 2, right? With an Ancient Tomb, Talisman, untapped land, play an Urza Saga, or an Urza Lord High Artificer. This allows the deck to maintain pressure. One of the things that Jeskai does very, very well is trade 1-for-1 on resources and then refill with a recall. They're not able to do that when you're providing an onboard threat. They have to expend resources to deal with the onboard threat, which prevents them from holding up as much interaction as they would like and playing the more controlled game plan that they would like, which means hands that play off of Urza Saga, of course weak to Wasteland, but otherwise very strong, allow you to deploy the Urza Saga and to deploy the threat while still holding up the ability at any point in time to pivot to a Time Vault game plan, applying both the mid-range pressure within a deck that also forces people to hold up interaction for almost the entire game in the event that you just throw a Time Vault on the stack, puts the opponent into very challenging gameplay patterns. And cards, again, like Inquisition and Duress and Thoughtseize, allow you to surgically remove your opponent's answers to deal with both game plans simultaneously. This version of the deck is obviously not the current version. When I went to this tournament, there was a few cards that I had thrown in sort of last minute for testing. I think Saheeli was my 100th card. But generally, this is sort of the guiding philosophies and principles of the deck, is you want to play high efficiency threats, high efficiency answers, play a mid-range game plan, and at any point in time, always be threatening to win the game on the spot and hope that your opponents are forced into play patterns that are very challenging as a result. Between the first version of the deck that I took to a tournament and the second version of the deck, of course, the new Ixalan set came out, and that made some changes. So the addition of Fabrication Foundry and Duskrow's Reliquary helped me improve the removal and interaction suite. The Savine's Reclamation was in the deck. Really, I just wanted a way to get to never lose the game just because Time Vault was in my graveyard. It's not super common for it to happen, but sometimes you just get Thoughtseized on turn 1 and you need a way to buy it back. The Fabrication Foundry is the most mana efficient way of returning Time Vault to play. It's 5 mana plus an artifact to get it into play. Codex Shredder, for example, also an artifact, also tutorable, is 6 mana to return it to hand plus the cost of playing the spell. So Fabrication Foundry, being a tutorable artifact, is a fundamental ability, is sort of the toolbox card that I was looking for to reclaim access to the graveyard when it's necessary. You'll notice I also swapped up the removal suite. Duskrow's Reliquary, the new card. This card is phenomenal. Came in for Portable Hole. Portable Hole is still a very playable card, but Duskrow's was particularly, it's just better in almost all scenarios. And I was testing out an Abrupt Decay over a Prismatic Vista, but that didn't stick around. I went up from 31 to 32 lands, adding in a Boseiju. A Stifle made it into the deck. This card is also a card I've been super impressed with. Being able to essentially Stone Rain players on turns 1 and 2, once again allow that deployment and that tempo game plan. You're looking to deploy an earlier threat and use that to maintain pressure. Stifle helps you do that really, really well. It's also, it's a cheeky tech to hit your Minsc and stuff like that. But more importantly, it's a way to hit fetch lands to keep people off of a mana and disrupt their game plan in such a way that allows you to begin to deploy your threats while you're waiting for an opportunity to jam the combo. Adding a Boseiju in just for the space. Essentially, I wanted to go up a land, and Boseiju is a good spell, so that was it. And then Orcish Bowmasters is just sort of a really good Magic card. Leading us to sort of modern day, there's more cards that I've been testing as a result. Some of these should be somewhat self-explanatory. A City of Traders, it's another idea that you're really trying to deploy these early threats, early stuff early on. And so adding in a City of Traders allows you have to sequence it properly, but it allows you to, land something, City of Traders, play a Talisman, hold up 2 mana. That 2 mana breakpoint is really relevant when we're talking about this. These loose focuses, these mana leaks. Having 2 mana up and being able to hold 2 mana up so that you always have interaction is sort of a fundamental crux of this deck. I did part with Miscalculation. It's the worst of the 2 mana counter spells, but adding in a Spell Pierce. This deck, again, some of this tech, like a Dread Fugue, I'm curious about going up an additional piece of hand hate. The Soul Guide Lantern is to deal with Reanimator and Breach decks that I was starting to have trouble with. And yeah, there's a Minskimbu that I'm testing right now, sort of just as a red card to throw in. This card's very, very good. I really have the support for it in the deck. This is primarily a Sans red deck, but I really like the idea. It's just a matter of, is it good? Speaking about sort of the matchups and the mulligans for this deck, I generally keep 7s. One of the ideas of a deck that has high card quality, similar to a deck like Jeskai, is that you want to have as many cards and options as possible. Making your land drops every turn is pretty important in this deck. You really want to be able to deploy a turn 2 Talisman, a turn 3, whatever it is you're going for, or another 2-drop rock and holding up 2 mana. Being able to maintain your land drops, continue to increase in mana, because this deck uses mana very, very efficiently and very, very well. It's pretty important. Some of the matchups that I think this deck struggles with are matchups that go underneath it. Holding up, if a deck can beat one piece of counter magic, it's generally going to be somewhat tough. The crux of this deck is that you're trying to sort of buy time to find the window. This is a combo deck at its core, and the control and mid-range game plan sort of supplement it. And so when decks can beat your turn 2 Remand, followed up by a turn 3 Rock or something, when they're able to beat those things, decks like Flash, decks like the Storm decks, when you're not able to surgically extract what you need out of their hand to disrupt their game plan, those decks can be pretty challenging for this deck to beat. I generally fear combo decks more than any other type. There's, the strength of aggro decks, of course, is that they generally don't care. They're going to put a threat into play and sort of kill you. Balance is one of your key cards in these matchups. You can keep a hand off of pretty much balance alone. There's a lot of there's a lot of different ways this deck can sort of quote unquote high roll, which gives you the ability to sometimes mulligan if you're in a matchup that's pretty tough, down to 6 or to 5, because you're not too worried. Because a hand with land Mox, Talisman, untap, land balance is pretty backbreaking because you're stripping a lot of cards and a lot of creatures out of play. Decks that generally try to accumulate advantage over time are decks I feel good against. Things like Jeskai, Jeskai Green, Jeskai Black, decks that are trying to establish a sort of not necessarily an advantage engine, but sort of tempo you out resource to resource. This deck plays pretty well on, because you force them to play more interactive than they want to, because if they tap out, they might just lose the game. And it means that they can't necessarily deploy a third path Iconoclast and just sit behind it, because you put a 4/4 construct into play, and that's a pretty quick or an efficient clock. Some of, I think, the key cards of this deck, if I was to talk about defining cards, the Academy and Urza's Saga land package is probably the most distinct. This deck is really, when you think, really at its core, this deck is an Urza's Saga Tolarian Academy Time Vault deck. I think the third most important card is Urza's Saga, because this card is essentially what gives you it's the most powerful mid-range game plan you can have, that is one of the most challenging to disrupt. Outside of pretty much Wasteland, of course, Stifle is handy in those situations, but outside of pretty much exactly Wasteland, it's almost impossible. I guess White March, but it's very, very hard to interact with Urza's Saga, and you can blank a lot of the counter magic that players sit on with an early Urza's Saga. They don't necessarily want to be countering your Sylvan Scryings or your Wargates, but knowing that the card that they're going to go find is an Urza's Saga sort of forces them to do so, which sort of clears the way. You can double threat in a way. Sylvan Scrying into, or Inquisition into Sylvan Scrying into play Urza's Saga is a pretty mana efficient way to present a pretty strong game plan. And as you draw cards for the next 2 or 3 turns, you might just draw another one of your tutors for Time Vault, and all of a sudden you're now able to present the combo at any point in time. Colors in this deck are interesting. I'm playing 3 Triomes. As a deck that's trying to play artifact lands, right? We're on the full set of 4 on-color artifact lands. This is a Sans Red deck. I wanted to have access to my colors. So one of the things I discovered when I was playing the Cosmic Games at Cosmic Games is I wanted to fetch a Bayou a lot. So I'm playing 5 duels, everything except for Savannah, and then I'm playing the 3 blue Triomes in this 4-color combination, Rafine, Zagoth, and Suarez. One of the ways that you can sort of sequence colors in this deck is that if you have a Vault of Whispers, the Triome to go with it is Spar's Headquarters. You know, if you have an Ancient Den, you want to go find a Zagoth Triome. Getting access to all of your colors, even if you have a monocolored land in your hand or in play, is very powerful. And so a full set of 10 fetches sort of complements those 3 Triomes and makes better for sequencing game plans. Current versions, I'm playing Mana Confluence and City of Brass. Like I mentioned before, I threw in a Minskimbu just for testing. It's the only red card. I wanted to see if I could support it with just a red Talisman, you know, the Mox Diamonds, Mox Opals, and of course these rainbow lands. Spire of Industry is another rainbow land that didn't end up making the list in sort of the long run because it doesn't fix your colors unless you already have sort of the artifacts in play, and these artifacts are also what help you fix your colors. So being able to play around Blood Moons and Magus of the Moons, even, you know, back to basics, not that it's particularly popular, having artifact mana gives you a lot of flexibility in that regard. Similarly, one of the weaknesses of a deck like this is going to be Collector Oeuvres because you do have so many artifacts, which is where Urza Saga and Tolarian Academy come into play. Being able to tutor for and have lands that are threats and mana unto themselves, even when, you know, a primary game plan is being as disrupted as a Collector Oeuvre for a No Rod might be, is pretty powerful. And so I'm really impressed. You know, the lands really make up a core fundamental part of this deck. Even something like Inventor's Fair does double or triple duty in that it turns your, when you start accumulating large quantities of mana and you start creating a lot of permanents, sometimes what you struggle with is the ability to convert and to seize the window when it's available. Inventor's Fair sort of helps you open those windows up by turning your land tutors into artifact tutors. Of course, there's a few utility lands. You know, Caracas is pretty backbreaking against some decks, and you can tutor it up pretty commonly as needed. You know, Basic Island for Path to Exiles and Assassin's Trophies and the Initiative. Of course, Odawara, I think, is probably, I mean, honestly, I think this is one of the best lands in the deck outside of the aforementioned Academy and Saga because removal spells that are not spells are very good. It helps deal with Collector Oeuvres and Magus of the Moons, and it is tutorable in a way that, you know, sometimes you need access to removal, and Sylvan Scrying helps you find it. Going through the artifact suite, you know, after the lands, I think artifacts are sort of the second most important card type in the deck. You've got most of the standard, the things you would normally come to expect, you know, your mana vaults, your manifold keys. Retrofitter Foundry is an absolute house against a deck like Jeskai. It's very hard for them to beat Urza Saga into Construct, into Retrofitter. These sort of permanents, if not addressed, take over the game by themselves, and it blanks counter spells, which is pretty backbreaking. I've been really impressed with Top. Top is one of the most powerful cards in that it gives you the ability to see a lot of cards for a very low amount of investment. This is a deck that plays a decent amount of quote-unquote silver bullets. You have also a lot of cards that perform double or triple duty. So your transmute artifacts not only represent, you know, the combo kill, but also represent a multitude of other smaller threats like Retrofitter Foundries or even the One Ring. This card is ridiculous, by the way. I mean, you probably already knew that, but the One Ring is really insane, especially in a deck that's already playing keys. One of the things that I did drop from the Cosmic Games after the Cosmic Games event was Minamo. Its primary synergy is, of course, with Tolarian Academy and the One Ring, but I don't find that this is a Tolarian Academy that taps for 5 or 6, and so making 11 or 12 mana with it is not necessarily something this deck is trying to do or that it pays off particularly well. You mostly just want this Academy to tap for 3 or 4, sort of at the high end, and then, of course, it helps play around Collector Oeuvre really, really well. Something that I've considered going deeper on is interaction for specific types of decks. Soul Guide Lantern is sort of the only hard silver bullet that I'm playing. This is a pretty flexible one. I've had discussions about playing the Black Spellbomb, Nihil Spellbomb instead. They're both very close. I like the fact that this one ETBs and hits a card in the graveyard. It can be pretty obnoxious for some decks to deal with if they've already started setting up a graveyard. And you can hit, you know, specific things that are planning to be flashed back or played out of the graveyard. And, of course, you know, the ability to just sort of wipe the board or wipe the whole graveyard to stop things like your Treasure Cruises and your Dig Through Times, as well as hitting Breach and Yogwill is handy as well. For the most part, I shy away from cards like this that are very specific in their use case, but don't have broad-reaching strengths. Soul Guide Lantern is sort of my one concession to sort of giving up on card quality in favor of specific toolbox cards, because I just needed a piece of graveyard hate, because it single-handedly can beat some decks, which is nice. It's nice to have the ability to just win off of an Urza Saga that goes finds a Soul Guide, or some of these other artifact tutors, just putting that piece of hate into play and making it very challenging for your opponents to beat or to play around it. I think the rest of this stuff is pretty self-explanatory. These suite of 2-drop talismans, 3-drop rocks are pretty close to unplayable. We want to be able to have 2 mana up almost at all times, which means a turn 3 talisman allows you to hold up 2 mana, but a turn 3 3-drop rock does not do so. So there's no Coalition Relic, no Sonic Screwdriver, things like that. The interaction suite and the instant suite is, I think, pretty finely tuned at this point. I really have enjoyed Spell Pierce and Stifle. I think Spell Pierce is generally better than Miscalculation. It's nice to be able to cycle it, of course, but 1 mana interaction is sort of premium. We have the one-off Swords, because Swords is just a busted card. It's the most efficient, mana-efficient form of this removal in the format. Same with things like Mental Misstep, Ponder, Preordain, Brainstorm, where we're talking about playing specific effects. We want the best version of them, and we don't want the second or the third best version. One of the cards that I played in this version of Time Vault that didn't make it was Profane Tutor. Profane Tutor is obviously a very, very strong card, and when I was more leaning into tutoring and more leaning into combo, it was an excellent card for that purpose. In a deck that wants to top deck very well, like I like to keep 7s, I don't want to be drawing Profane Tutor on turns 3 or 4 or 5. I only really want it early. And so I want to be drawing cards that help me or provide additional support to the game plan that I already have established at that point in time, which Profane Tutor generally just doesn't do. Modal Mixture is one of the cards I'm considering back and forth, thanks to Voltaic Servant, which is this card. We're going to get to it. This card's insane. But thanks to Voltaic Servant, this does find both pieces of the combo, which is very nice. And of course, it is also a counterspell. So the ability for it to do sort of double duty in both protecting your combo and finding your combo gives it a lot of flexibility, even though it is not particularly efficient on either front. The fact that it does both is very nice. I don't leave home without Force and Force. These cards are, as pretty self-explanatory, absolutely ridiculous. But I just can't imagine not playing them. And this deck is primarily blue. 40% blue. So it's not too hard to be able to pitch cast them. And of course, this is an Academy deck, so hard casting them is not outside the question either as the game progresses. One of the huge boons and pitches for this deck, of course, is the fact that crop rotation is now 0 points. When I was originally playing, when I first started playing Academy decks, I had to lose a point to crop rotation. The fact that I can just free roll this in my deck with the Time Vault and Academy, and again, Urza Saga being a card that I just keep bringing up because it's so good. Being able to free roll it is just incredible, and crop rotation is definitely a fundamental part of that. Enlightened Tutor, of course, it's just the most mana efficient artifact tutor that we have access to. This card's great. Notably, this card is also finds enchantments, of which Urza Saga is an enchantment. Very, very good card. I have Enlightened. It's very frequent for me to hold up 2 mana and then just end step Enlightened Tutor, go find a combo piece, untap, kill you, which is very nice. Similarly, my final point, of course, the point spread here being, the Mana Vault, the Time Vault, and the Tolarian Academy are sort of locked in. I would not leave home without a Mana Vault, especially in a deck that plans to play keys like this. Mana Vault hands are some of the most explosive hands that this deck has access to, and creating busted board states, having 3 or 4 or 5 mana on turns 2, 3, 4, especially if I'm untapping the Mana Vault with the keys, is very, very, very powerful. So I wouldn't leave home without this. Tainted Pact is sort of the last choice, and I tested a bunch of different ones. I ended up going with Time Vault here. I went with not Time Vault. I went with Tainted Pact at this event, and I'm still playing it. I tested Mana Drain. I think Mana Drain is one of the considerations. This is a deck that loves its 2 mana counterspells. Mana Drain can be very explosive, especially when you're untapping into the One Ring or untapping into Tezzeret the Seeker or all sorts of stuff like that. But Tainted Pact is really nice in that it finds both pieces of the combo pretty safely. In decks that play A+B combos that rely on other cards to sort of end the game, You can't really Taint a Pact for an Underworld Breach or Taint a Pact for Black Lotus in a combo deck like that. Not that you can play those cards together, but the idea being that you can Taint a Pact for Time Vault, because if you exile half your library to get there, it doesn't really matter, because killing after you've established all of time is not particularly challenging. I think some people play this card too conservatively. I've Taint a Pacted for one of the reasons Taint a Pact is really good is that it finds like your sorceries and instants. I've Taint a Pacted for balance on a number of it. I once Taint a Pacted for balance, and it was like the 12th card from the bottom of my library, and one of the cards left in my library was Urza's Saga, so I just won the game because I was able to establish a threat even with only 12 cards left in my library. So yeah, Taint a Pact is ridiculous in finding balance. I also Taint a Pact for Force of Will and Force of Negation all the time because there's 2 hits. You don't, 66% chance to find one of them before you find you have to exile your Time Vault to get there. And so Tainted Pact being both instant speed, free interaction, and a piece of your combo, and a balance, and or a Thoughtseize, and or whatever it is you're looking for is kind of ridiculous. And I've considered cards like Intuition, I've considered cards like Mana Drain, but Tainted Pact just impresses me over and over again. And I like the foil, so I play with Tainted Pact. I've gone through some of the sorceries before. Obviously, in this version, I'm now testing Dreadfugue. I think that more hand attack is very good. Dreadfugue, the cleave cost is not that prohibitive in this deck because you are making a lot of mana. Most of the time, it's just a slightly worse Inquisition of Kozilek, but understanding what threats you need to deal with and when you need to deal with them, and early hand attack and disruption, especially when your Mulligans are mulliganing to 6 or 5 because they're scared of how quickly you're able to kill them. Like, this deck pretty regularly presents turn 3 and turn 4 wins. I'd say once per match, you're able to have a hand that does that. Means your opponents always feel on the back foot in terms of mulligans, and cards like Dreadfugue and other forms of hand hate can really punish those mulligans, especially if they're, mulliganing to land, Collector Oof, and you're like, cool, well, before you get your Oof down, I'm just going to take it out of your hand, and now their whole game plan is falling apart. I've gone back and forth with some of the tutors here. Reshape is the one that frequently comes to mind as one that I'd like to not play if I could. I think it's still better than Fabricate. The ability to sacrifice an artifact, specifically as a way to get rid of the One Ring, preventing it from killing you, is not irrelevant. And same with Transmute Artifact, where it's nice to be able to ditch artifacts. Transmute, of course, being very, very good. It turns a 2-drop Talisman into a Time Vault for no additional mana, which is super efficient. Wargate is one of the great reasons to be in green, in addition to white and green, of course, being the sort of I think white is the second most played color in my deck, but black is one of the a lot of the deck's philosophy is based around the black cards. So the fact that we're sort of base Esper with splash green and sort of justifying all of those colors are cards like Wargate, being able to find, again, basically every single piece of your combo and find your 2 very, very powerful lands is a huge part of the Wargate strategy, and same with Search for Glory, which also finds the One Ring, Tolarian Academy, or Urza's Saga. Lorien Reveal, this card's just good. I mean, it's nice to have a island cycle for land filtering. You find we play all 3 of the main blue duels. Of course, we play these 3 triomes, and then, worst case, it's a Tidings. Don't hate that. One of the things that I like about this deck is that most of its sort of quote-unquote value engines or value creatures, cards like Baleful Strix, Esper Sentinel, Urza, these are sort of threats that exist unto themselves. Well, not that they're threats necessarily, but they're sort of a mid-range plan that exists unto themselves that also provide layered synergy with the artifacts. Oko makes food. Food buffs your creatures. There's not as much emphasis on cards that are just purely raw card quality unto themselves. Things like Uro. Cards like Minskimbu or Comet. I'm testing Minskimbu as I'm curious if I can just splash a singular red pip in this deck. But I've mostly avoided cards like this and Murktide, things like that, because I'd rather play threats that generally layer with the fundamental game plan of the deck. A card that was in the earlier versions that isn't sticking around is Karn, Scion of Urza. I wanted to make Karnstructs. Karnstructs were the plan. And, of course, having a Planeswalker with a 6/6 blocker in front of it generally tends to win games. It didn't stick around. I don't think it was as good as it needed to be. Same with Kappa Cannoneer. That was a card. This card is very, very good, but I found that I'm not able to deploy it early enough for it to be that much of a threat in this deck. And having just a 5/5 blocker doesn't always win the matchups it needs to be winning. And the decks that really struggle with Kappa Cannoneer are decks I already feel good into, so it's not sticking around. One of the exceptions to that is Orcish Bowmasters. This card, similar to the Soul Guide Lantern, is more of a specific matchup sort of winner. Orcish Bowmasters is absolutely brutal for aggro decks to beat. Death and Taxes, one of their least favorite cards to see is the Orcish Bowmasters, because they're like, cool, land Mox Thalia, untap, land, play 2 1/1s, and you're like, all right, you move to combat, great, I'll flash an Orcish Bowmasters, ping one of your 1/1s, and then block the other 2, and you're trading 3 for 1 on this card. It also is very good against, recall decks. Not that I particularly feel like I need help against recall decks, but it does provide that as well. So this is one of those cards that just feels so good to play and is so good into certain matchups that I'm willing to play it, even though it doesn't really layer with any of the rest of the strategy. A card like Oswald, on the other hand, is basically purely because of the way it layers and the strategy it provides. If you don't have removal, this card wins the game by itself. If your opponent can't remove it, you just win. And that is a pretty ridiculous threat to put into play, and it's very hard to beat. Outside, you have to basically have artifact hate or tutor hate, otherwise they will lose to Oswald. And sometimes your plan is just land, Mox Diamond, play Oswald, untap, play a land, turn your Mox, tap your Mox Diamond, turn it into a Mana Vault or a Top or a Retrofitter or a Key, and then hold up a 2-piece of counter magic for the removal spell they're going to play on the Oswald. And an Oswald they can't remove is the end of the game for them, and that's pretty strong. Tribute and Trinket Mage are just very flexible tutors. The fact that I play both of these over Fabricate, and there's a lot of reasons for that, but primarily the 2/2 body matters a lot. Being able to, again, tempo, being able to play into aggro decks with short run things that sort of stall and delay that allow you to set up for a combo kill and continue to provide pressure. These cards really, really help in doing so. It feels a lot better to tap out on turn 2 or 3 to play a 2/2 blocker that's going to save you 5 or 8 life against Gruul monsters or something, or make attacks a little bit less favorable so they can't just swing with the team, is super, super relevant when you're setting up for a combo kill. Into aggro decks and Gruul monsters and D&T and stuff like that, I generally feel very favored because they don't typically have clean answers to Time Vault. If they don't play Collector Roof, which some decks don't, you just keep hands that jam Time Vault and they generally can't beat it. You're faster than them in the most case. But cards like Tribute Mage and Trinket Mage help a lot in allowing you to establish a combo without just dying to combat damage before it's too late. I mentioned Voltaic Servant being an all-star. It is absolutely an all-star. One of the cool parts about Voltaic Servant is that, similar to a Talisman, you can tap 2 mana for it and it refunds 1 mana. So if you take 3 mana, you turn it in, you spend 2 of it on Voltaic Servant and untap an artifact, and now all of a sudden you've still got your 2 mana up for this sort of 2 mana set of interaction suite. Voltaic Servant is also a 1/3 with Vigilance. The fact that it's a 1/3 is really, really good. It's very hard for decks that play a lot of 2/1s to get in through it. It makes combat very unfavorable, and I love seeing a Voltaic Servant against decks like D&T, because if they don't remove it, it's just a combo piece sitting on the board, and it's a blocker that sort of gets in the way of their sort of aggro and fundamental game plan. I don't think there's much I need to say about Urza. This card makes a blocker, it makes a bunch of mana, it's an outlet for a bunch of mana. This card's just really good. It's also a 1/4, another card that's very hard to attack into. I think Teferi is one of the best cards I can resolve against counterspell decks. I mean, it is empirically one of the best cards to resolve against counterspell decks. It fundamentally invalidates interaction, and this card is almost impossible for Jeskai to beat once it's resolved, because it negates so much of their game plan. Once again, this deck was designed to sort of beat Jeskai, and Teferi really helps. In the semifinals of the House of Cards tournament, I played this insane, it was the same Mana Vault key opening hand that involved me resolving a Teferi on turn 1, and that was the end of the game, basically on the spot. They could no longer interact with me, and I was allowed to just do essentially whatever I wanted for the next 2 or 3 turns until the game ended. And so this card is really, really impressive and very, very hard. It's also a removal spell, which is very nice, and again, playing cards that tempo and cantrip, like Remand and Reprieve, sometimes you just want to play a Teferi, bounce a creature, cycle, and then they just untap and kill it. But that's fine, because what you've done is you've purchased time. And as it turns out, the more time you have, the better off you tend to be. Oko is just a fucked up magic card, and it synergizes with the core artifact game plan. Just sort of a slam dunk here. Tezzeret, another absolute all-star. It is not only a win condition unto itself with the -5 if they forget or don't deal with it, I've definitely played games where I just resolve a Tezzeret, uptick the following turn, make 6/5/5s and swing for lethal. The fact that it untaps cards like Mana Vault and Grim Monolith is also just a huge boon. It's another card that allows you to sort of deploy a threat and then untap and hold up this 2-mana counter magic. And of course, Teferi, who slows the sunset, does the same thing as well. This card also untaps, Time Vault and Academy. So you can usually, when you untap an artifact and a creature, or not an artifact and a land, you're untapping 2 different mana sources. So again, it's a 4 mana, put a 5 loyalty Planeswalker into play, hold up 2 mana of interaction. Or you can just spend it on a card like a Voltaic Servant or a Baleful Strix, and it sort of builds its own protection. Of course, it also untaps Time Vault, and the life gain on it is extremely relevant in a lot of matchups. I have Time Vault comboed with a 1 ring on 2 counters, or even a 1 ring on 3 counters, because it buys me, if I have 7 life and a 1 ring on 3, because of Teferi, that gives me 4 turns to find an answer to my own 1 ring before I run out of time, which is really handy. And then Minsc and Boo, of course, is the testing slot for this deck. So that's sort of a tech on a tech on the deck itself. Some of the stuff that I'm thinking about or that I've tested that I've looked at in the past, of course, you can see all the remnants of this Thoracle Academy list in the sideboard. I very rarely remove cards from the considering. I just sort of chuck things in here, and then I have a list of stuff that I've looked at and seen. Cards like Tezzeret, Agent of Bolas is a card that just sort of never really made the cut for me. It wasn't good enough for what I was looking to do. Of course, Uro, Murktide, these are some of the cards that I talked about choosing not to play because they are very good, but they don't fundamentally layer with what I'm trying to do. And Kappa, of course, being a card that does tend to layer, but didn't tend to be good enough, so it didn't make the cut. I tested Phyrexian Metamorph for a while. It's nice, it's cute, it's not good enough for this deck. Tishana's Tidebinder is a card that I'm really looking at finding a spot for and continuing to test. This is, Stifle attached to a stick. It is pretty brutal against, fundamentally, it turns off Planeswalkers. It makes your turn 3 comments or Minsc and Boos completely invalid when it counters their activated ability because it blanks them from ever being able to activate those abilities ever again. It removes all abilities from the card that it hits. It's also a 3/2 flash. So again, we're playing into sort of this instant speed deck plan while also being able to present a 3/2 threat that sort of blanks Planeswalkers. Fabricate, of course, I've mentioned a couple times as being a tutor that doesn't make the cut. Bring to Light is another one. If this found Planeswalkers, I think I'd be interested in it. But creatures, Planeswalkers are artifacts. I think I'd be interested in it because you could cast the 1 ring off it. But creatures, instants, and sorceries are just a little bit too narrow, and we don't have a busted creature, instant, or sorcery in this deck that really can justify the 5 mana cost of Bring to Light. Ancient Stirrings is sort of a cute cantrip, but it just doesn't make the cut. Spell Snare, Evasive Action, Daze, Miscalc are all the counterspells, and even Logic Knot to some extent are counterspells that I've sort of tested and decided that they're not really where I want to be. I'm looking for a certain level of efficiency and flexibility from my counter magic suite, and none of these are all just the worst ones they're all still good cards, but they're the ones that are the worst of the ones that I've tested and don't necessarily make the cut anymore. One of the cards that was in the initial testing builds was Candelabra, and of course, similarly, you had the Deserted Temple and the Manamo. This came, of course, from Paradox Academy, where you really want to untap your artifact to make a lot of mana and do stuff with that lots of mana. This is a mana-efficient deck. The curve is pretty low. I'm really trying to play a lot of 1s and 2s, and with a curve that's so low, making 12 mana just doesn't really do anything. There's not a lot to spend your mana on at that stage outside of maybe Urza. We just don't need cards that go that big that quickly. 2 of the other threats that layered with the game plan, similar to cards like the Tezzerets and the Urzas, are Shorakai and Thousand Moon Smithy. Shorakai felt so slow. I was really unimpressed with this card. It takes 5 mana to make a 1/1. I don't really feel a need to draw and loot that much. And Thousand Moon Smithy is just sort of win more. It's so easy for you. Like, if this card triggered on the end step, it would be one thing. But the fact that you have to untap and tap down 5 artifacts just to flip it, and otherwise it's just a 4 mana, make a slightly better construct. I'd rather just play Karn because I get a construct right away. But Karn isn't good enough, and unfortunately, Thousand Moon Smithy isn't either, even though Barracks of the Thousand is kind of sick as hell. Signets are tough. This black-green talisman in this testing list has become a blue-red one just because I threw in a Minsc and Boo, but this would be in the deck otherwise. Wishclaw Talisman is one of the other pointed cards versus Tainted Pact that I thought a lot about. The problem with Wishclaw is that this card really pretty much is only for winning. You don't want to activate it in any scenario in which you aren't immediately ending the game. And this is not a deck that wants to spend its points only winning the game, right? Taint Impact also finds my combo, but it finds it during the end step, and I can cast it for things that aren't the win. And so its flexibility is just so much higher and so much greater than a card like Wishclaw, even though sometimes I wish I could Wishclaw, tutor for a Wishclaw for balance kind of thing. I wish the Enigma Jewel was good. It's not. It's unfortunate. Life moves on. Pithing Needle, another one of those cards that I considered splashing for, but I think I'd rather play Tishana's Tidebinder if I was going to play a card like this. And yeah, I just generally don't like super narrow effects. Wishclaw or Pithing Needle is good at hitting like one or two thing, or one, stopping one or two specific types of combo. I'd rather play something that is more generally relevant. Sylvan Library is just a holdover from the Oracle days. Portable Hole, still a good card, still totally valid, still totally reasonable to play. I don't, but I don't think there's any real reason not to, other than I'm not playing it right now. I think it's perfectly reasonable to include in your deck. I tested Wasteland for a bit with the idea that I'm a card that's trying to deny resources and sort of interact in a lot of different ways, deny mana, stuff like Stifle, but my land drops are so important. Playing an Urza Saga, playing a Talent Academy, like this deck has very, very strong lands, and wasting a land drop on a Wasteland just generally did not feel good enough, and so it didn't make the cut. These Artifact Bridges, the Great Furnace, these are cards, of course, holdovers from Paradox Academy style decks. Teleria West, Land Tutor. I think this card is just so bad. It's upside, right? It's a flexible. It's both a land and a spell, but the land side is really bad, and the spell side is also really bad. I'd rather play, a Sylvan Scrying, those types of cards that are much more efficient at doing one effect or the other. Outside, basically exactly Muddle the Mixture is one of the few cards where I'm playing a card that is inefficient on both sides but has flexibility to do both. I just don't value the flexibility on both sides of this card. If I'm going to play a land that is a land in addition to being a spell, I'm going to play Boseiju. And even Boseiju isn't in the list right now because I wanted to make space for the 5-color lands. I don't think that City of Brass and Mana Confluence are necessary in a pure 4-color version. I cut them because they make aggro matchups tougher. Losing that life is relevant, and mana is already pretty good with 3 Triomes and 6 Talismans and a Felwar Stone and Rainbow Moxen here. So it was one of the cards that I would probably be playing it if I wasn't testing Minskinby right now, but because I wanted to throw in this random red card to see if, this card's just so good, to see if I could justify it. That's sort of where we're at with the deck right now. So I think that's most of what I have to say. So that's sort of the history of the deck, where it came from, the philosophy, the counter spells, the hand attack, walking through some of the ideas, things that I've been testing, things that I'm looking forward into the future. I think that I'm going to be continuing to play this deck for quite some time. It feels very good into the current meta. There's not a lot of decks that I particularly fear, and even the matchups that are quote-unquote bad still feel close. I still feel advantage in a lot of scenarios. And yeah, I've just been pretty impressed, and I hope this inspires you to pick up Time Vault, try different brews of Time Vault, and pray that Urza Saga doesn't get pointed, because then I have to give up my sweet Taint Impact. But, if I lose Urza Saga, if I lose the point, if Urza Saga goes to 1, I'll still be playing it. This card's absolutely insane. So, maybe I should change this deck to Vault Academy Saga, because this card is just that good. But hopefully this was interesting. Hopefully this was useful. And yeah, chat in the Discord about Vault Academy, because this deck is sick. Thanks for watching.